Hello, everybody. Um, yeah, I'm trying something a little different this week with visuals. I hope you can still see me. I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of a wave, but I mean, I can see me, so maybe you just have to find me. So it's been almost 2 weeks since my last video. Yeah, I mean, it's taken me a while just to kind of decide what trajectory I should go with this. There's a lot I want to get into, but I really don't have the time to do it all. So it'll be fun just getting through it, but it's not even like it's a trudge or anything. It's just, how would I say, there's a bit of an existential challenge to it that, I mean, I enjoy to the utmost, but I mean, I've been consulting with people that I trust about some of the ramifications of what I'd be proposing would be, and here I am just testing out, the drawing features just to make sure the screen is clear. We can make this as informative and productive as possible with the little time available to us. Yeah, so last time I was essentially, suggesting a system whereby we begin a project of remaking the world, making great works and whatnot. But with it comes this sort of a tragedy of the commons issue, where even though there's an incentive to create something great just for the sake of doing so, and the benefits of it pay dividends for generations to come, the lack of technical need to maintain it kind of becomes its own self-destructive pathways. If you build machinery that doesn't need maintenance, you create something that doesn't produce jobs, the economy doesn't, self-sustain the way you'd want it to. So I've kind of been working on ways to deal with this as a, how would I say, generational issue. So first we were talking about, let's see if we can get this, yes. So first we were talking about, the little system to have, our beautiful planet. and let me clear this up for us. Alright. So let's get this done right. Still getting used to using the tablet, as you can clearly tell. So first we start off with our planet. It is currently an oval. Let's make that a little more circular. Alright. And our systems in space, in orbit, to move signals back and forth around the planet, this constellation. Alright. So I want to go into more detail about some of the substructure we'd need to make this function. And with it comes the power generation needed, because, let's see. to make this whole planetary grid work well. So the idea being you have these ocean-bound objects beaming information back and forth between themselves but at the same time you also get to beam power between them. So and then from any point on Earth you can use the constellation as effectively a super router system to get information back to Earth. But I kind of glossed over some of the it's only an hour-long video, which is long for anyone's attention span, but I glossed over some of the bigger issues but also promising features of this system, right? Because right now we have a space junk problem, and essentially what that means is there's just a bunch of crap, in low Earth orbit. And with these systems being able to beam, like right now it's a particle beam being used to construct them. You send up oxygen and hydrogen particles to create water in orbit that would then be mixed with things like carbon, and this is partly using the carbon nanotube structure to grow crystals. Like, it's essentially using these space stations as giant single crystals that would then be used to collect, refract, and move light. So, the sun is the main power source for these systems, and the particle beams from Earth. Oh, that's nice. The colors actually come through. So here, let me leave that. Because last time the colors weren't as visible. So right now we have the sun as our main power source. So these are effectively solar arrays, and the beam energy we get from Earth is what we use to construct these objects. So the problem now is, how are we going to generate the energy to even get the particles up there? And the beauty of this sort of system is that it's entirely ecologically sound, because it doesn't need to harvest energy from anywhere but ambient forces, and effectively it's all solar powered. I mean, all 90% of the processes on Earth are powered by the sun, and the few that we don't see are geothermal, which are nuclear powered. But for all intents and purposes, this is a solar powered system. But one of the nice things we get is the potential for wave power. So let's say you're, on Earth, and you're now building, you're at sea, right? Now this color isn't quite thick enough. Let's see if this works better. Alright, this is better. So you're on Earth, you're at sea, you're working, and, trying to working on an offshore platform for oil or something like that, right? Very often these things will go defunct once their collection is done, and beneath them is create. That's annoying. very, very crude attempt at drawing an offshore drilling platform. And let's add a substrate. So this is the Earth. Bottom of the sea, essentially. You know, you've got a tube, drilling, pylon. Well, in this case, it's a floating offshore drilling platform, but generally, these pylons go pretty deep, if not all the way down. Yeah, they're generally multi-layered like this. And essentially you break off the top two layers and you can float the offshore platform somewhere else to drill. And that's kind of the main way we harvest energy from the oceans right now. Second way we do it is with windmills, and there's been proposals for wave power generation, but the tricky thing is that the amount of energy generated from them is usually not very effective because of the issue of this. Like, to put it bluntly, it's poor engineering and lack of vision in how to build these things. So, in the platforms that are generating the particle beams to be sent up to construct these giant floating petals in the sky, the massive crystal platforms, the space stations that are in one part solar arrays but also clearing space debris from all of our previous missions and future missions so that space remains viable for us as a species and we're not stuck on Earth. We've got to, let me clear this out a little bit. Again, let's see. And I'm trying to draw these waves evenly just to convey a particular message, right? So now there are two types of waves we're seeing here. Long form waves and short form waves. And the idea is that they're existing on each other. So in reality, the wave as a whole is a combination of the two waves, but for all intents and purposes, we're dealing with one or the other. It's kind of the basics of wave. Well, all waves kind of behave like this. It's a constructive and destructive interference of different wave sizes and wavelengths in a shared medium, right? So now imagine now we have a structure built, now floating on top of this wave. This isn't a depth model, this is on the surface. And here, let's make this grayish. Alright. Oh, it's not as visible as I'd like. Control. Let's drag this out a little bit more. Alright. So this is a simplified version of what I'm thinking, but the idea should come forth a bit. So you've got this structure, and in it, a central hub, right? So each of these arms is articulate. Meaning, let me make this more clear. They all move independently of one another, right? So, what you can do is that you can also break this off into sections, right? And this is a structure floating in the ocean, where the tail is much more sensitive to smaller waves, and the bulk of the ship is sensitive to large waves. So you can generate energy from the motion of the waves interacting with the motion of the structure, right? And now let's make a flat version of this. I guess the idea would be to make this in profile right now. I'm trying to think of a good way to represent this. Okay. We'll freehand it, whatever. So the idea is that this would now be the structure, dum, dum. Alright, so, and let's say you have a little bit of an anchoring, keep things centered. Doesn't have to go all the way to the bottom of the ocean like before, but you have, different levels of sensitivity. Notice that this is essentially shorter and smaller than a single one of these small wavelengths, and the whole structure is smaller than the big wavelengths. The big wavelengths would be the tidal waves moving around each day, gigajoules of energy, like energy enough to power anything. This is the main erosive force on the planet. Every year it destroys millions of miles of beachfront properties, tsunami waves, this sort of thing. The scales, even a tsunami wave may be a bit too big for something like this to gather energy from, because it would kind of just ride it out. It would just ride it through, but your daily tidal waves, it'd be the perfect size. You could configure this thing to be just the size of a particle wave. Not the particle wave, the tidal wave. So you know exactly how to calibrate this sort of system based on the location, and it's tunable to wherever it is. So if the waves are really small and choppy, you tune one arm a little bit, and then based on the direction of the wave motion, you can turn the ship around to improve the functionality, right? So what this will be doing as well is gathering the energy it collects into this central hub. This thing can also, collect solar power as well. But the idea is that the energy being generated by the arms funnels into this central well. And in this central well, you're taking the water, you're essentially passing it through a particle accelerator, getting it close to the speed of light, and then boom, you send it up into orbit to grow one of these crystalline structures in the sky. So it's a simple infrastructure set up to build crystals in space, right? And it's an easily repeatable model. Like, it's self-sustaining itself. It's one of those things that once you get it going, it pays for itself. And the added benefit of it too is that these are great places to build, lives and cities on, because the amount of energy we're talking about are so ridiculous, right? The costs of living and maintaining the structures would be very small compared to the costs associated with beaming the energy up into orbit. But these things are producing so much energy that there'd be a surplus regardless. Just, you're harvesting from the oceans, the greatest power store on the planet. It may help with reducing global warming, just, taking energy out of the system a little bit. I do worry about changing the flow of energy too much on the planet, so there would have to be, great monitoring of these sorts of systems, but there should be more than enough to extract safely without making any major disturbances to life on Earth, right? And as these structures go through time, you start to be able to build small cities on them that in time let's make the cities black. These are massive, mile long to kilometer long platforms, depending on where you'd want to be doing your collecting. And the nice thing about these things as well is that they can move and follow ocean currents, so they'd essentially be like moving cities. There's above you these things. And even these structures that I'm drawing here would be more like city blocks than individual buildings. Right. And parklands and whatnot be growing around. But also one of the great added benefits of a system like this is that you can then use this sort of space around it to increase the local oxygen, right? You can create a net flowing around. Let me switch to something. There we go. So you can make a net around such a structure. As a fishery, it moves with this. So you have essentially an aquaponic farm tied to this sort of structure, and fill it with algae, schools of fishes into separate cordons. So the city becomes sustainable on multiple fronts. It can feed itself. The algae produced can be used to create biofuels as well. But you're already on a giant energy producing platform, so why wouldn't you be using electric cars? And with this structure you get a whole host of benefits. The air on it would be very clean. You could harvest plastic from the oceans for building materials. It's the idea of these things is that they're supposed to be super efficient. They're the cities of the future, but also sorts of mega projects that actually inspire you to do great things, right? So now let's get rid of this. I've been getting a sense that I want to save these images, but again, it's more the concept that matters than the actual image itself. So, alright. So I honestly wouldn't have time to go back to these anyway. So now, you've built these structures, they're generating megajoules of, not even megajoules, petajoules, gigajoules, ridiculous amount of energy, harvested from ocean currents, the movements of the waves, tidal waves, the daily tidal waves. So, it's a reliable power source in that way, and on it you can have, your solar arrays, the whole thing can be covered in solar panels as well, and the solar panels can also double as wind turbines. So there's a whole complex system of energy production you can use the system for, and it could even be moved by the wind if you change the organization and orientations of the buildings, like if you put them on swivels, for instance. So you use a little energy to turn the buildings around, and from there you channel the way the wind flows through it and propel the entire vessel, right? So it becomes a fun and sort of crazy engineering project that like, it's bound to inspire for generations. This sorts of things, like, would be pretty hard to destroy, even with like a direct impact from a nuclear device, sort of thing. And defending these things, like, you'd be surrounded by nets anyway, so radar, sonar. You'd be feeding the fishes. You'd be creating artificial archipelagos with these things that would help feed the wildlife. You can effectively use them to revitalize the ocean life in general. So, like, just as platforms to help humans, but also life in general on Earth, I can't really see a downside to them unless they're built incorrectly and cheaply, which is, again, kind of what got us here in the first place. So, the struggle, right? So, moving forward, you've got the platforms at sea generating energy and harvesting, the trash on Earth to build themselves. You have this, and beaming up, particles of hydrogen and oxygen to create giant crystals in the sky. Then you've now got water in high Earth orbit, low Earth orbit, in orbit in general, that is then used to sustain future space travel and keeps the economy of water moving. And one of the beautiful things about this is that it becomes a model for future explorations, right? We can plant one of these things on other planets, the moon, Europa, for instance. Even though you're dealing with ice rather than water, so you can't really use wave power in the same way. And you need to be much bigger to harvest from the gravitational tidal forces imposed by Jupiter, right? Or I can't even remember what. I think it may be Saturn that Europa orbits, but it's orbiting a gas giant. So, it's an ice moon. Harvesting water from them will be a bit trickier, but for water worlds, this is kind of an ideal system, right? It becomes a fun model when you turn these structures into balloons as well. So, let me find my cursor. There we go. Oh, lost it again. There we go. So, probably should not be using such a bright color, but same sort of structure. And now you place it in orbit around a gas giant, right? Gravitational, this pull of this thing is massive. But the nice thing is that you now have these things acting as different points within a balloon. And they're filled with gas, and they're resting atop layers and layers of atmosphere. So, the weather on Jupiter is ridiculous. And it's filled with similar particles, hydrogen, oxygen, helium. There's some carbon, methane. So we can use this model to harvest from gas giants. And using the same model to then effectively beam power up, and using the stresses put on the craft to harvest energy, because these are articulating joints at these corners, right? So So a nice added benefit of such a structure is you can then create these deep siphons that work very much like the standard oil rig model, but you can then penetrate to different layers to harvest different materials. And at the bottom of these tubes, because consider by the time we're doing this, I've got some solutions to some of the carbon nanotube problems, but still needs to be tested. I just got a new microscope that I'm hoping to use for these sorts of studies, but time will tell, right? So we have fun little molecules that are formed in the gas giants that are incredibly useful, but the problem is that they're only produced at high pressures, and it's hard to know if they'd even be maintainable at low pressure environments, because they may just want to blow up. But there are some indications that suggest that they become stable and produce internal tension once they get locked into place. So these things would be like metallic hydrogens, right? And the idea being you use these tubes to create a line. Let's hope this is visible. It's essentially the oil pipelines of the future, right? And these would be, braided tubes of carbon nanotubes. What's it called? And I can draw a simple example of it right here, right? So imagine this as being one of these tubes, the head, right? And this is clearly not perfectly drawn, but hopefully you start getting the idea. I mean, we've all seen weaves like this before in various everything. And the idea now being, right, the head, because you're harvesting gas, it's just a matter of negative pressure, which you have because there's already a lower pressure down here than there is at the top. And it's just a matter of creating the channel for the pressure differential to flow. These are essentially like roots. These are like now lotuses or flowers, using the same principles as plants to use the natural pressure of the gas giant to then force. Oh wait, let me get this color back. And force the hydrocarbons at these low levels, upwards. So that's one of the great benefits of just having this solar system. The amount of materials we get access to by one first building something like this on Earth and then having experience with it and then pushing into space pays exponential dividends, because then you create a self-sustaining industry that is largely automated anyway, but you still need humans there to maintain them and to learn from them, to translate that knowledge into the later systems we'd be creating, right? And the beauty of these sorts of systems being able to be translated in a universal way to, gas giants, which seem to be by far more common than rocky planets. Okay, that may be a bit of a presupposition just because rocky planets are probably just more fragile than gas giants, so gas giants tend to last longer. Gas giants probably consume most rocky planets anyway. But the way this ends up shaping up is that we create a stellar economy based on harvesting matter from these gas giants that no longer has to threaten our planet at all. And, these systems being able to harvest the material to produce themselves from the environment, because you can build this sort of structure out of plastic and a little bit of metal to facilitate the magnetics that need to happen, but most of the conductivity can be handled with carbon nanotube systems, right? So working at the nanoscale to solve the carbon nanotube problem is something that I've been working on for a while as well, but it's the sort of thing that you kind of need to be careful about in terms of sharing and also doing the research yourself, because it's not exactly the safest route to be doing anything. Because carbon nanotubes are great for energy storage, conduction, but the individual tubules, if you breathe them in, can cause every disease you can imagine. Neurological disorders, cancers, whatever you name it, can cause it. But they can also be used for healing, so poison and the treatment. But it's much harder to heal than it is to break something. So, and honestly, modern science hasn't really gotten to a point where we can use them effectively yet, because it's the sort of thing that crashes entire industries, so it doesn't really get a lot of support, right? But now, with these planet-bound vessels and the space-bound systems become, a clonable system, can translate them across the entire solar system, harvesting energy from any number of planetary systems. What's there to do? Humans are just going to keep expanding. And there's a level of, I'd say, kind of boredom that comes with this, because it's a level of technology that we don't really strictly need unless humanity grows to be, something truly massive. And, the nice thing about this sort of structure as well is that in harvesting the planets, they can be designed to be interlocking. So, let me get back onto drawing a little bit. So there's, tiling space. So imagine this is the sun, and you've got a series of these. Well, the question is, can you tile space with heterogeneous structures? And the answer is yes, if you break it down into triangles. So there's a sense that actually, let me see if I can get this right. Almost got it. I actually used the wrong type of star pattern. But the idea being, if you use basic geometry to break down these structures into triangles, right? So this is the 4, 5, and 6-pointed stars. Pretty much identical wingspan. It's a little tricky. But between them, it's a small subset of shapes you need, particularly when you have a common central hub to all of them. So that way you get compatibility with these shapes in terms of, they're essentially doing the same things, but they're operating in different medium. So one is better suited for working on Earth, others in orbit. The 6-pointed shape could be maybe not necessarily flat, but a full dodecahedral Merkaba structure in orbit. So it's a 3D crystal rather than a 2D crystal, which has its own benefits for harvesting energy. As orbiting the sun, you don't need to rotate it as much, but you can also do things like turning that energy to warp the fabric of space-time to create stargates that are stable and continuously open, and with that you can harvest energy directly from the sun's core, for instance. So that can be used for a whole, the possibility, saying the possibilities are endless is such an understatement for what this potentially allows, just because it's countable infinities and uncountable infinities, right? And life is already an uncountable infinity, but once you have structures like this, the amount of energy available to the public, the modern citizen would effectively have access to the energy output of the entire human history of energy output. If we had, 1 trillion humans, but we'd have multiplied the energy production of the human species by 1 trillion, quadrillions. The amount boggles the mind, because one, we're then Earth, a small planet harvesting energy from a gas giant like Jupiter, which is our closest gas giant, right? Even just harvesting the electrical, the electrical flux of the, the magnetic field of Jupiter itself. The ionosphere of Jupiter, I'm not sure if that's the right term for it, but would be, we can't harvest it. We don't have anywhere near the capacity to do so. But it's just such a mind-boggling amount of energy. So there's no shortage, period. Shortage is just something that we've created for ourselves as society to maintain a status quo, right? And once we get the entire society out of this mindset of energy shortage, we can start doing things that opens humanity up to whole new depths of understanding. Because one of the things that's been bothering me in particular is this idea of, I guess it'd be misery, that I found in a lot of philosophy, right? Because yesterday I was going through, Schopenhauer's On Pessimism, right? It was after a few other books on philosophy and whatnot, and there's a sense that a lot of philosophers and a lot of spiritual teachings glump on this idea of life as being suffering entirely, or being generally disappointing and things like that. And I think the only way we can move past that sort of thinking is to actively make life wonderful. And I don't mean like wonderful, yay, happy, but like literally full of wonder. And it's already like that in terms of seeing life and the existence of the great nuances of reality around us, but just making it more apparent, I don't think would be harmful for us as a general rule. And especially when like labor is no longer the issue, but imagination, and you got to recreate, the society from being focused on labor, because we'd have non-sentient robots able to handle much of the grunt work. So it's just a matter of design work and humans getting assistance from things like AI, just to augment the powers of our imagination to help us create these structures. And one of the things that I wanted to go into, I guess can wait for later, is this idea of how we handle religion, or really like creating societal social structures that make it easier for us to come together and build together and enjoy each other's company, right? But it's still a challenge in terms of formulating this and not having it be an edict from on high, right? Because this sort of thing doesn't work if it's mandated to, force people to participate. That's why I've been working on designing this sort of structure to be self-sustaining and profitable the entire way through. It's a modification of an oil drilling platform for a reason. It's got to be something that, we know the structure generally works. We're harvesting wave energy rather than, oil to begin with. And having that technology mature and having a set trajectory for that technology opens us up to harvesting energy from outside of our solar system, exploring different star systems, and I can go into ways that we can handle faster than light travel. It's the sort of thing that is considered an apocryphal tech, in that those in the know it's possible, but the energy requirements are such that it's not even energy, it's more energy or informational requirements, right? It's that idea that knowledge is power. And that's when things get worrisome, because if energy applied over time is work, and the ability to control work is, I don't want to get into the physics of this as like a semantic dance, but it's the best way I can describe it in short form is having the knowledge necessary to make something happen more effectively / efficiently is the sort of power that doesn't gel well for maintaining status quo, right? I mean, just simply put, right, this planned obsolescence issue. We keep making products that are designed to fail within short order so that they're continually replaced. And it is good for small incremental advancements in the technology, but it automatically disincentivizes anyone that makes a paradigm shifting move. They get regulated against, just like, Elon Musk and the Tesla car company. We've had electric cars for, well over 100 years. Electric cars were built before gasoline power cars. They're much more simple to construct. So the only reason we didn't go into, advancing the battery technology is because, oil is one already a very energy dense fuel, and it's easy enough to convert a steam engine system into burning, rather than coals to oil. It's that sort of simple trajectory. But with this, how you say, madness in terms of prioritizing, short-term petty wealth versus long-term growth of the species, we get lost in the mud of, decadence, so to speak. Because, right, the energies, I think I was reading something about, the Large Hadron Collider used enough copper to go around the orbit, the copper wire, to go around the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, or maybe once or twice or something like that, which is ridiculous. But that was used to understand reality at the finest, smallest scales, right? And now, this is not using any real, any technology that's really that far out of our reach right now, because you can use carbon nanotubes with resin printing, and that's one of the projects I'm gonna be doing soon. So, just to increase the effective abilities of the material, and then passing electric currents through things to increase the binding rate, and just a whole host of really fun effects that you get with these sort of tech mixes. But it's again the problem of funding projects. And that's kind of where I am with this sort of thing right now. I can go into more about the structure of the cities on these structures, right? Because you need a societal model to have. They need to be functioning as cohesive groups, and then there's this idea of how do you produce a effective culture that works towards a common goal, right? And with this, you get this worry about competition. It's a common human challenge. And it's one of those things that I've always kind of avoided. I can, can't say if I haven't said it, but the idea that we compete with ourselves more than anything, and then working to be the better you, the best you possible. But then applying this over, a city scale, what is the best you can get from a city in terms of effective production? Because, with this structure, you can create the city and the waste management system, because you're now building an aquaponic infrastructure around your city. City feeds itself, it handles its own waste automatically. And these sorts of structures can very well hold a larger percentage of the human population more cost effectively than living on land. So it becomes a potential alternative to life as we know it. Food costs would be very low. It's a lot of seafood, but who doesn't like sushi? A lot of people don't, but you can also grow rice. Problem being that you need to desalinate the water, which, costs energy, but there is an abundance of energy since you're living on a energy production plant, so desalination is not as much of an issue. And you can use solar desalination as well, and use the energy collected from that to, handle your issues. Waste heat production from this sort of system can be harvested to help with the desalination process. Beautiful things like you can have nuclear reactors supplementing the power generation of such a system, and having small reactors on each arm, and then using the energy production to fuel greater growth. It proves, one, that the sky is not the limit. It's just a standing point. It's a waypoint to greater progress. The scales of progress are beyond anything that I think humans have dared to imagine. And it is kind of terrifying, just because it's human ant colonies, in a sense. So there's one more structure that I really want to get into that I keep kind of forgetting. I mean, largely because it's not mission critical, but it is very useful. So again, we have our superstructure, central hub, and I'm drawing this every which way just to show that it's an adaptable form. It doesn't have to fit one discrete path and pattern. That's good. And let's add secondary structures. Right, so I like to call these lily pads. So let's make them green. So I showed earlier how you'd have aquaponic structures. And now these allow you to create different production zones, different artificial biomes, because one of the nice things about these things as well is that it allows us to explore the oceans without putting people's lives at inordinate risk. This is the beginning of a new age of exploration, but it's exploration more for entertainment than any mass, I mean, yes, there's resources coming into the fray, but it's because of the knowledge is power problem, right? And the amount of knowledge that the human race is accruing is far outpacing our energy demands. Because, exponential growth is the human population isn't growing at anywhere near as fast a rate as the amount of information we're collecting and starting to understand about reality. So let me draw one of these things in profile. Oh, I'm also realizing I may have been speaking too low for a lot of this. The audio might be shit. Oh well, we'll fix that later. So let's have a little so this is another shape. And yes, this is a dick and balls, but it's there for a reason. So on a lily pad, boom. Oh, it's not letting me. That's not annoying in the least. I'm trying to do an inverted triangle, but I can do it with just half. Alright? So on a lily pad you can have a launch platform for space, space launches, your whole... I mean, we see these things with SpaceX already, barges set to sea where they launch their rockets off from, right? But one of the nice things about being able to build at gigascale structures like this is that you can use, temperature differentials across, let's say 150 feet to create water condensers, because, one of the issues I was citing earlier was desalination, right? Instead of using heat energy to desalinate the water, you can just collect desalinated water directly from the atmosphere. So these would be like mountain structures, right? And a couple of these can be for, like this one here would be a rocket pad, whereas 4 of the 5 would be water production. And you connect them to desalinated water production, so pure water, pure drinking water, funneled from funneled from these structures. That is interesting. There. So, funneled from these structures to a corresponding arm. Maybe not directly into the tip, because you don't want to dampen the production of, energy, right? So, you have aquaponic layers, you can have freshwater stores, even on the inside of these little... Let's see if I can get this done right. So these would be little pools of fresh water right by the rest of the aquaponic structure. So, we'd have different layers of water storage. I mean, you'd never go thirsty. Hunger would be a thing of the past. You'd have acres and acres of space to produce food, and it's a matter of, laying out extra netting. Because on each of these outer lily pads, for instance, they'd also have their own little water storage. So, they may not always be at the same level, but it's much more efficient than what we've got going now. And these systems grow themselves. Even the plastics that we need to do this, if we run out of plastic in our oceans, we just harvest more from beneath the ocean, because it's still based off offshore drilling platforms. We can still drill deeper to collect these hydrocarbons. So it's not like there's a shortage of anything, really, to do this work. And it's a matter of efficient energy transitioning, because, we're not looking to refine out the volatile hydrocarbons anymore. We're using the hydrocarbons in their entirety to create these massive structures anyway. And we can harvest CO2 from the atmosphere directly. And we can also use silica to do a lot of this as well. So it's not like it's trapped by any given material, right? So one of the things that inspired me with the study of the aqueduct system from ancient Rome is that they'd use local materials. So your designs would need to be adjustable for whatever environment you're working in, which has its own series of benefits for these sorts of projects. Just having the flexibility to do this in different ways is part of why I like the design. Because it's not so much a fixed design as much of an idea of a design that can be adjusted to whatever the circumstances may be. And even this structure, right, the ship structure, because of the modular nature of it, it can be taken apart and put back together. It can move, like these structures. Let me get here. Pick a different color. Right. These structures should all be able to, swivel left and right, as needed. In addition to, standard up and down, the movement of the waves. And then within the central hub, let's do a little spirally motion. One, having a particle accelerator in there is pretty useful, just for, if you want to create higher energy elements, want to store massive amounts of information as an energy loop. Even I was studying the brains of octopi recently, and they actually follow a very similar structure to this. So they have a loop for a brain that their mouth and esophagus goes through, so their brains are able to analyze everything that goes into there. And they can sometimes die if they eat something too big, but they have beaks so they can break down anything that they eat, right? To small enough levels that it's only a dumb octopus dies, and not by choking, right? And their intelligence is kind of terrifying, because for all intents and purposes, I'm pretty sure a large octopus would be smarter than most humans. But yeah, I'm not even gonna qualify that with anything. I very much believe that. Here. So with these structures, right, you can get an algae layer, and you can scale these structures up with the necessities of whatever. So you get an algae layer, which produces breathable air in case you have, in case that becomes an issue later on. I mean, you've already got the drinkable water that's already closer to the habitat, and this would be like a saltwater basin that would support, carp, salmon, whatever sort of fish schools one would want. And, energy production is happening in these corners, and so each individual unit has its own energy production that's being siphoned and sent towards the hub. And then you've got secondary energy production happening, and then the siphoning process to boom. And let's do the beam. Send the particle beam into orbit. So these systems aren't incredibly complicated. The principles are very simple. The productivity is there. And really the practicality is there too, because, these don't have the same issues we have with modern cities, in that they aren't self-contained. Whatever products we need can all be produced on site, to be honest. Though importing in the beginning of such a structure will be difficult, just because, importing always is. But once you have the system going, we've got 3D printing, and you can collect silicon from the ground in the form of sand that can then be you know, filtered and cleaned and harvested. But you know, you don't really want to disturb the ocean floor too much, because you don't really want to disturb the life down there too much, and it's filled with bacteria that are doing all this work to keep us alive. So the idea is to minimize that sort of damage, but there's a lot of surface area under there that can be harvested from, and you can always pick relative dead zones to harvest from and choose to move resources between these. You know, they're essentially city ships. And it's also a good practice as a species for once we're interstellar species. So it's, you know, crawling before you run. Because we don't do much walking around here. Oh wow, there are actually more ships that I could have used. No. I didn't even built the system before, but we'll get to that later. Alright, I think this is enough for today. Thank you guys for listening if you got this far. Much more coming soon. I guess I'll get into more of the, you know, the social implications of all this later on. Alright, let's see.